within the world of positioning, there tends to be two camps. There tends to be the creative ad agency camp, and they do positioning in a certain way, and they very much see positioning as a creative endeavor, which it is in parts. And then there's the engineering academic camp, which see positioning more as a linear, let's fill in the blanks type of process. And the challenge is both of those two tribes often hate each other, don't talk to each other, and both in its absolute form are actually wrong. And they're wrong for a variety of reasons.
Welcome to What Gets Measured, a NinjaCat podcast about marketing, performance management, metrics, and effectiveness. Because what gets measured gets managed. I'm your host, Jake Sanders. A board-level strategist for big brands, startups, and nonprofits alike, Faisal Siddiqui, founder of Creative Business Company, is on a mission to make brand marketing more accountable and effective for everyone. He's cranked out white papers, been quoted by the BBC, lectured at York University, worked with Shell, Turkish Airlines, and Google, and today he's here to talk about brand positioning. Faisal, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Jacob. Thanks for having me. How are you?
Oh, I'm so great. I'm happy because we're going to crack into the positions of the brands, which are selling or not selling, is what I thought. But there's more. So let's start with positioning a brand. What do we mean when we're saying this, and how does it overlap with marketing strategy in general? Just talk to me like I don't know anything, which is true.
Well, I don't know if I know any more, but let's start with the second part. So I think if we think about marketing more broadly as the 4 Ps, now whether it's practice as such is a different conversation. But
that's right.
Yeah, if marketing is the 4 Ps, which is promotion, product, place, and what's the price, then I suppose positioning and positioning strategy is the strategy component within promotion. So the way I think about positioning, which is not too dissimilar to anyone else, is the who you are for and what is the unique value you can deliver to them. And what was the first question you asked? Because
I guess it's the position. When you're talking about position, is that just the place where you can get the most market share, or is it actually like an affect of the way you're within the vertical, or
That's a wonderful question. I think it's a bit of both. So I think one, the position is the place within the market you occupy and the for whom. So if you think about your product, is it high end or low end? If you think about who you're serving, it could be young people or old people. So it's where you fit within the market map. And the second thing is also your posture. So what is the personality that you exude? How do you engage with your audience, and how do you behave as well? So I think it's a bit of both.
Yes. And so are there examples of like positioning problems that seem like something else entirely? Like how does someone know that they need to reposition, or
Great question. So I actually think positioning is the most important thing that you can get right, that you need to get right in a marketing strategy. And every single marketing effectiveness study, all the way back to the studies that Ogilvy did in the early 60s, to some of the work that Binet and Field did in effectiveness and context, show that when you get your positioning right, it is perhaps one of the largest drivers of long-term effectiveness for your brand. In one Ogilvy study, they showed that a different positioning would drive profitability for an ad campaign in a delta of 5x one way or the other. So getting the positioning correct is the number one thing, I would argue, that actually trips up a lot of brands because they don't actually have the right one in place. And I'll explain why. I think there's 3 or 4 places where the positioning shows up. One, your positioning is going to show up in your ad such that in a very noisy environment, let's think about B2B advertising or B2B content marketing,
right,
where everything sounds the same. Your positioning is going to help you stand out. So first thing, so you as a result, you have to deliver fewer ads because you're getting it noticed. The second thing your positioning is going to be doing is imagine that same prospect sees a second ad from you. And guess what? There's some thematic connectivity between ad one and ad two. So that's driving recall for the brand. Where's that coming from? Oh, that's coming from the positioning. The third thing, let's assume that they do go click on the ad maybe by the second or third time. They go to your website, and then there's the copy on your landing page. What is actually going to draw them in, convert them, perhaps maybe not to a sale, but to another page on your website and deepen their engagement? That's going to be your positioning. So if all three of those touch points or those stages of the journey, if you're underperforming, if you're noticing that your ROAS is kind of low because you're having to serve multiple ads to an audience before they even notice them, or say your percentage of video viewed on a video-based ad is low, one, your positioning is wrong. Two, if you think about if you do a brand perception study, why is it the fact that there's no consistent perception of what we are good at in the market? Again, that's positioning. Three, once they get onto the landing page, why are they all bouncing or only handing out on a page for half a second? That's reason number four. So or reason number three, or I forget where I am in my
Right.
in my list. But so positioning really shows up in a whole bunch of places. And I think that the main challenge is that people often solve these issue sets in a very me-see, mutually exclusive way, when in fact they are related. And what's driving the performance or sub-performance of all of those things is often the position.
So, and maybe somebody thinks their positioning is wrong, but it's something else. Like you kind of touched on that just in that last sentence. But I mean, have you ever seen someone who thought they needed to reposition, but they actually had other marketing problems?
If someone comes to me and say they have a positioning problem, I'll sell them a positioning project.
Yes,
I won't dissuade them
gladly.
from that fact. No, I'm joking. I'm joking. To be honest, I don't see that often. And the reason why is that is redoing a company positioning. Let's not talk about product positioning, but reading a company's positioning tends to be a very invasive procedure.
Yeah.
So I don't think people drive towards that right away. What I do see sometimes is new CMOs come into a brand, and often that's the first lever that they'll pull, which is like, let's do a repositioning and let's redo the brand, and then resulting in a visual identity. And one of the things that we very much focus on at Creative Business Company is how do we transform central brand teams from this idea that they're a bit of a logo police. They're not really tied to key kind of revenue drivers of the business. How do we transform them into a strategic partner to the business? Well, the first way for a new CMO or a new head of brand is don't go ahead and reposition the brand. Don't go ahead and develop a new visual identity, because that sends all the wrong signals. It's sending the signal to the business that you're only focused on the most superficial parts. What I would often do is run a brand study first, perhaps do a brand architecture, a portfolio piece of work, and then from the kind of outcomes of those, then develop alignment and some quick wins inside the business. Then you're more primed and you have far more credibility to have a conversation about a positioning and visual identity. I don't often see people say, let's do a positioning, but they don't actually have a positioning issue. It's rather the order in which they do things. It could be optimized.
You said something really interesting, which was it's an invasive procedure, repositioning and stuff, and it sends a different signal. One of those signals was inconsistency. Like one of the maybe things that puts people off from doing a repositioning is that it looks like, and I don't know if this is the truth, because marketers are always loving to change things and they don't know when to leave things alone. And I think
100%.
you're right. It is maybe just, here's my mark. I did this for you. We've focused on this surface level thing, but is there ever a consideration from brands or maybe hesitations where a repositioning makes it look like you don't know what you're doing? Like, is that a fear that maybe somebody has? Because it's like, you got a new logo, like, What's going on? Does anybody have any of those hesitations, or am I just making something up?
That often does happen sometimes in crisis scenarios. So,
Mm.
for example, in Canada, there's a large engineering firm called SNC Lavalin, multi-billion dollar engineering firm. They were caught up in a bit of a political influence scandal, and then subsequently rebranded. So, and repositioned themselves. Often
Mm.
in use cases like that, the perception from the market is that, oh, they're just doing superficial change, that they're not actually driving compliance changes in the business, and they're trying to pull the wool over our eyes. They're doing the easy part.
Right.
And so that does happen in certain what we call kind of crisis comm scenarios.
Mm.
Those tend to be less in frequency. What I think more happens, or why I think the fear that the market will see that as a result of you positioning, that's admitting some type of failure or a need for a course correction.
Right.
Often the use case for asking for a position or repositioning is the fact that the brand is not performing in the market to the
Right.
extent that they want to. And so by that definition, that actually tells us that not enough of the market even know us.
Mm-hmm.
So
Oh,
if not enough of the market knows us or thinks about us in the right way, that use case of looking embarrassed in front of the entire market doesn't really come into contention as much.
mm. And you're saying something really good, which is from your colleague Ian Barnard, was the TAM, the total addressable market, can shift, expand with a reposition. Is that right, or am I making
No,
that up?
absolutely.
Or
Well, absolutely. And I think the often that will change, though the nuances that will change, though, because the business has decided it to change. So we worked with a med tech brand called EngageMD. They started within the fertility space, but then they started selling beyond fertility to other medical specialties. But what's happened is that the brand is still stuck in the past. They're only narrowly perceived within the fertility space, but not amongst buyers within other medical specialties. So in that use case, what has happened is that the business has expanded its set of capabilities, but its brand has lagged behind. So therefore, the repositioning exercise is an attempt in broadening its relevance beyond its initial cohort. Another example of that is we work with Morningstar. So Morningstar is huge within managed funds, within the retail investing space. So that could be individual investors or their advisors or the wealth managers that advisors work with. But Morningstar has grown far beyond that. They have they have private market data, they own PitchBook, they build products for asset managers, but often institutional managers and asset managers perhaps don't know that. And so the exercise there is, how do we increase the relevance of the Morningstar brand beyond its initial set of cohorts? So in effect, you're increasing the TAM of the brand, but you only increase the TAM of the brand if the TAM of the business has increased.
right, the offerings
And
have been or the product services have been expanded to
exactly.
get the new business naturally. So if you like, give us sort of an example of you come in with a brand that is in need of repositioning. How do you sort of marry the legacy of things and switch it? And then what kind of silly conversations are you having around, like, we really like the circle, and you're like, but I think triangle. It's like you people spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on this stuff. I mean, we're laughing, but it's so for real. How do you work with a brand that's in need of a repositioning and kind of blend the past with the future?
That's a great question. I think let's focus it just on positioning and not visual identity, if that's okay.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry that I put that out as an example. Yes, the
But
positioning
I
is
get it. But
completely different, but yeah,
the same discussions happen just on, what do the words say?
right.
I think it would first help by spending a bit of time on, like, what are the dominant positioning, the ways to position a company that are out there. And I think this is often what leads to kind of one of the biggest challenges I see with positioning. Within the world of positioning, there tends to be two camps. There tends to be the creative ad agency camp, and they do positioning in a certain way, and they very much see positioning as a creative endeavor, which it is in parts. And then there's the engineering academic camp, which see positioning more as a linear, let's fill in the blanks type of process. And the challenge is both of those two tribes often hate each other, don't talk to each other, and both in its absolute form are actually wrong. And they're wrong for a variety of reasons. If I focus first on the ad agency way of doing a positioning, usually what it is, it's a big idea. There's like a slogan, and then there's like what they call a manifesto, which is a bit like a poem to the brand, from the brand to itself.
Yeah.
The problem with that type of positioning deliverable is that it's frankly unusable for the business. So once you go ahead and do this, how do you then activate that for performance marketing teams? Are you going to give them the manifesto and they're going to infer, they're going to squint their eyes, read the 500-page or 500-word poem and say, okay, this is what it means for my campaigns? It's completely impractical. And often it lacks the strategic rigor because they actually haven't thought about, does any of these words in this poem or the slogan, do they link with the drivers of purchase, what people actually care about? It's really, really high level. And
it's common sense. Like, just like what you said, it's like, and it's high level, but at the same time, hello. Anyway, keep
exactly.
going.
And often there's a kind of wrong held belief within kind of that creative tribe that there is no actual functional points of difference within this brand. So therefore, we have to bubble up to like a bigger purpose. And the challenge with that, you just get really, really silly kind of examples of like the toilet paper company talking about world peace. You'll have the B2B company talking about how it serves communities. And it's like, no, you don't. And so the brand becomes this kind of unusable, slightly CSR tinged thing that eventually everyone in the business ignores. That's one camp. Wow. The second camp is your kind of academic camp. And in the academic camp, you will have your Mark Ritzens, you'll have your April Dunfelds more at the product positioning level. But they've reduced positioning down to a kind of fill in the blank template. And it's for this segment, we provide XYZ benefits. The challenge with this camp is that the template itself is so reductive that it is neutered any ability to think more creatively around what the brand could be. So what often you get out of those exercises are dull pronouncements of generics. So for this random segment, the dreamers and the believers, how do you execute on that? No one knows. We provide trust, safety, and reliability. Well, no fucking shit, right? And so you have to go through all of that to get to that. Right. So both of these camps, I think, produce outputs that are just frankly suboptimal, and there's very little marrying of the two. Now, to answer your question, now I'm going to go back to your question. So sorry, I went on a bit of a
fantastic tangent.
Bit of a tangent. But the way to kind of marry what is true about the brand with what it needs to be in the future is driven by a very simple way of thinking, which says there are certain things that drive purchase within a market. So these are the top needs that segments have. And if a brand can deliver on those needs, people will buy from them. That's great. Now, those needs are generic to every single brand in the category. What you then have to say is, what are the capabilities that this brand has that allows us to choose which one of those needs can be most ownable to our brand? So if the top brand owns these one or two capabilities, we can own the second and third capabilities. And it's really a marrying between what is the unique value that we can provide to the market, and how do we ensure that that is actually relevant to the folks out there? So let's provide a very specific example. I'll give you two examples, one B2B, one B2C. I did some work with Formula E. Formula E is the electric racing championship. So there's Formula One and there's Formula E.
Cool.
Formula One, this was about 6-7 years ago. Formula One was the king. They had really fast cars, cool technology, good-looking people, lots of money, all of that. Formula E at that time was awash in kind of CSR messages, green the planet, change the future, all of those types of stuff. The problem was the cars were ugly, they were slow, and no one was watching the race. So what you have here is a situation where Formula E cannot own any of the top needs that the audience wants, which is super fast cars, really interesting technology, beautiful people. And they have their kind of like very environmentally friendly cars. So how do we leverage the environmentally cars in a way that actually allows us to compete? So the uniqueness of the strategy there was actually saying, let's take those environmentally cars, which are slow, kind of boring, they don't look that great. And is there actually a hidden advantage here? And the strategy, actually, the brilliant piece of thinking was that those cars had a hidden advantage. And the hidden advantage was that because they were electrical, because they didn't pollute, it actually allowed you to race in all the city centers and the capitals around the world. If you know anything about F1, other than Monaco and Singapore, F1 on the majority has to race in the suburbs because of noise and pollution constraints. So immediately we'll say, okay, that creates actually something interesting. We actually have this advantage as a result of this weakness, of this perceived weakness. So let's go ahead and take that and reframe it and say, if we only raced Formula E cars within the city centers, we can immediately create a new category of sport where we don't compete against Formula E. And then from that idea was this brand strategy about the street racing series. So it doesn't matter whether the electric car goes 300 miles an hour against a Formula One car. If you're going 150 down the Champs-Élysées, that's really, really cool. So that's an interesting example of how do we take something that's inherently true about the brand and about the company, which could be perceived as a weakness, and reframe it into a strength.
I know that there's people out there that are just like, oh, whoa, because there is not a lot of differentiation on products and services, like
That's
software
right.
as a service. I mean, it's software as a service. And then you're like, no, but it's different. And like, but there are still all these stores. I mean, right now I have hundreds of thousands of t-shirts in my city area, and everyone's offering the different, but it's basically something to cover my body and the top part of my arm, So then what is it that causes me to go to this place for a shirt versus this place, or a $300 vintage tee versus just something from Gildan, Target or something like that? It's very interesting to know that marketing, the function of it, it may just come down to positioning, because like there is no functional difference in between Coke and Pepsi. And I know people are upset now, but I said it. It's just a soda, and but there's something about the next generation, and then the polar bears, and then you're like, man, that's a positioning play, So how do you work with people to expose those weaknesses? How can someone go into the brand they're working with now, or if they're in-house, the higher ups, how do you figure out this hidden advantage? Because it isn't necessarily a unique selling proposition. It's something else.
Correct.
So how do you help? Like just right now, if somebody was like, help me, Faisal, what would you tell them to do?
Well, I think the way we do it is look at all of the elements of value beyond the product. So think about the service, think about the culture, think about the location, think about the beliefs of the people inside the company. Like heck, think about, what's a famous example of that? Think about Avis in the 1960s. Avis had fewer locations, budget was number one. Avis was a smaller number three. They repositioned around service. They bet this idea that if we try harder, that the audience would side with the underdog. And then from that service idea came a whole bunch of service improvements to the experience. So they had shorter lines, they'd come pick you up, all of those things. But that strategy came from a process of manufacturing an advantage around an element that was beyond the function of renting a car. It was from the softer asset, which was around service.
Mm.
So really the idea is to think more broadly, like ditch the basic benefit, which is let's take a product, let's look at the functional benefits it provides, let's look at the emotional benefits it provides. You and every other competitor are doing the exact same thing. That'll get you generally in the exact same place.
Mm.
But if you think more broadly around all of the elements of value within the value proposition that we just talked about, service, location, beliefs, so on and so forth, that gives you a far broader palette within which to work.
Mm. Thinking about service, like good customer service, is that a bad thing to lean on just because it's humans? And I mean, I just see like my brain sort of being like, I think it's great, but does it make it seem like I think what I'm trying to say is like the Avis thing is a great example. Like you have to change the way you're competing too, along with your positioning. Am I right? Like, because if I'm thinking it's a service and if our service isn't as good, then we're not as good. So if you're saying that and I'm talking about service as like renting cars, not customer service, does it seem like there's a bit of a kind of hesitation in there by saying like you're admitting that the thing that you're supposed to be making money at, you're not the best at?
I think there's two parts of what you said. The first one really talks about, I think, the difference between kind of mediocre positioning and top A positioning, which
Mm.
is top A positioning for a lot of top tier brands. They don't see positioning as a comms brief. Rather, they see positioning as the driver of a set of policies and behaviors inside a business.
Mm.
An example of that, TD Bank in the US, their brand promise is around unexpectedly human. Underneath that, they have three brand pillars, and those brand pillars are then translated into service pillars. So there's a operationalization of the brand and the positioning into the actual kind of policies and behaviors of a business. And this is what most ad agencies don't do, frankly. This is also what none of those kind of positioning template gurus will show you how to do, because
Right.
both of those exercises confine positioning purely to the communications function. So, to your point around how do you operationalize that, how do you deliver on that beyond the actual marketing department? Well, that's the most important. That's the most important part of a positioning, I would argue, because not every company is blessed with a multi-million dollar top of funnel ad budget. So
Right.
how else do you deliver the positioning? To your second part around does focusing on service, for example, does that almost acknowledge to the market that perhaps you're not as good on some of the other kind of elements or
Right.
product qualities? I
Right.
think an example of that is T-Mobile.
Hmm.
So T-Mobile, the entire Un-carrier piece of work was done at Profit when I used to work there. Profit is a David Akers firm,
Mhm.
but T-Mobile was number 3 or number 4,
Mm.
and Verizon and Sprint. Remember how we were talking about what were those top needs that compel people to purchase?
Right.
Well, the top needs in telco are service and reliability,
Mhm.
or sorry, coverage and speed, coverage and speed.
Oh, okay.
So whichever telco brand owns coverage and speed, they generally have the biggest market share, which is why if you look at any kind of Verizon ads, it just says we're covered here, we're covered here, we're covered here. And they don't have to be more creative. The market leader doesn't have to be extremely erudite or creative. You just say, these are the most important things that we know the market wants. We have that.
Mhm.
So T-Mobile could not compete on coverage or speed, but they made a bet that because Verizon was only focusing on coverage and speed, they were doing that to the neglect of customer service.
Wow.
And that was creating a huge F off pain point within the category, which is
Right.
true. So they said, you know what? We're not going to talk about our coverage and speed, but we're going to create this thing called the Un-carrier strategy where we are going to focus on service. We're going to allow people to rip up their contracts. We're going to actually treat them like humans. We're going to actually pick up the phone when they call. And that entire strategy drove an entire huge market shift. It went from number 4 to number 2 in the market. And from that came all of those uncarrier moves that I just talked about, from the breaking your contract to kind of free Wi-Fi to free roaming, all of those things. But all of that came from a strategic choice that we're going to focus on service. Why? Because we cannot compete on coverage and speed. So sometimes in certain markets, if you read a brand study, it'll say these are the 5 most important things in a market. Yes, that is true. These are the 5 most important things in a market in 2024. But we can change. Those things can change. And that was exactly the bet that T-Mobile made. And it focused on service, which was a number 4 driver of purchases and a number 4 need in terms of importance. But over time, it became more important.
So good. Now, how, I mean, you've already given us really great stories. So I'm going to skip the next question and just ask you this one thing. How can people discover what those drivers are? Like in telco, you were saying it's coverage and speed. How did they figure that out? And how could someone who doesn't have access to a bunch of market research, how can they figure out what those things are? Is it by working with the sales folks? Is it working with the service team? Is it maybe talking to close lost opportunities, trying to figure out what didn't work, or like what's your advice on finding those drivers, the purchase drivers?
I think it's a great question. Let's focus on B2B. 1, you can talk to your sales team. They'll have insights from speaking to customers. 2, you can review closed or gong recordings of win-loss conversations with clients. A lot of the time, the reason for the win or the loss is noted. So it'll say,
Right.
we chose you because of X, point 1, point 2. So those can serve as often as a proxy for those drivers and needs. I had said talk to customers directly. 3, interestingly enough, we've done some kind of initial, really, really rough work where you can actually ask ChatGPT to put in a prompt. So for these types of buyers within these sectors, what are the most important drivers of purchase? You're not going to get a perfect list, but you'll get a pretty good list to start working off of, right? And then you can further validate those in conversations with customers and your sales team. So there's lots of different ways to go about it. And then just circling back up to the kind of the Rolls-Royce way, because the Rolls-Royce way is often not done in the right way. What you want to do is you do a pathway analysis, and there's 2 different types of ways of doing it on a survey. One is called derived importance. The other one is stated. So let's just say a basic marketer or a basic market research agency will use stated importance. And stated importance basically says, let's ask people what are their top drivers and needs. The challenge with that is that often consumers, what they say and what they actually value, there's a disconnect between those things. And so derived importance studies will use a whole bunch of complicated market research math, which I'm not an expert in, but as a way to suss out what really drove purchase. So you want to go with derived, not stated. But for the person who does not have access to a brand survey, there's a whole bunch of ways. And I think you touched on a lot of them.
That's so awesome. And a lot of it is communication, like having a conversation. Do you think that face-to-face conversations elicit completely different responses and insights than a survey? Or, I mean, what's your thought there? I mean, did I answer my own question?
I think that you use them in different circumstances. So qual interviews are really good for providing directional input, we find, and then into a quant survey. They're obviously not statistically representative. So you use them in different ways. The quant survey is statistically representative, but doesn't have some of the nuance of the qual. So you want to use both.
Oh, that's so good. So you've given us so much of your time, so much of your expertise and tacit knowledge. And I mean, I'm already just like yum, yum, yum. And I'm thinking of all the previous clients I had was like, man, I should have. But if you were going to give one piece of advice on brand positioning, what would it be?
my one piece of advice on brand positioning, either for products, for divisions, or for companies, is that it is the biggest hidden unlock to drive the marketing performance for your team and for your company. I see so many kind of dull, not too thought through positionings out there, and almost scratch my head when you'll often have conversations with the same client who will then say, but our advertising isn't resonating, or people aren't engaging with it enough, or we're not driving click-through rates. Well, often the source of this is a sub-optimized positioning. So the biggest thing that I would say is if the biggest step change, if you want to get out of the kind of optimization game, going for 1-2% little gains, and want to go in the step change game, driving 5-10% or order of magnitude in performance, you really have to look at your positioning. And that is the source really of most of the performance and advantages for brands.
Man, I had another question, but we got to wrap it up. No.
Let's do it.
Damn it. It was basically... No, that's a great way to end it. If I can think about it, I'll email you. Dude, thank you so much for being here. How can people connect with you and learn more online, Faisal?
Check us out at creativebusinesscompany.com, or you can check me out on LinkedIn. We post a lot about positioning, marketing effectiveness, brand strategy, and brand portfolio. So that's creativebusinesscompany.com or Faisal Siddiqui on LinkedIn.
Cheese or chocolate?
Are you ready?
Done. Let's go.
Cheese or chocolate?
Chocolate.
Waffles or French toast?
French toast.
Sweep, then vacuum, or just vacuum?
Depends if you have hardwood floors or not.
Okay, yeah, the context depends. He's a marketer. He's
Framing.
a marketer. He can't help it. Volcano layer or floating battleship?
What's a volcano layer?
I would assume.
I
think it's a layer in a volcano. I'm gonna
go with volcano layer because that elicits in me thoughts of like tectonic plates, and that feels a bit more substantive than a mere battleship.
So good. He's given us full thought. He's using his whole cerebral output on this. Vinyl, records, or pants?
Well, I wouldn't want to be without pants, so I'll say pants. I'll start with pants.
Yes, so pragmatic. Finally, and most contentiously, the Beatles or the Stones?
Beatles.
Final answer.
Final answer.
What Gets Measured is a NinjaCat podcast. Please rate and review the show wherever you find your podcasts. Share this episode on social, and visit us on the web at ninjacat.io.